All right, so let's talk about UX and UI. Right, so we'll talk about user experience and user interface. They're much related to one another. One is more strategic, and the other one is a little more tactical. And user interface is basically the techniques and that we use to foster or implement a good user experience. User experience is more strategic, in that we try to take the user as the center of the world and identify who our audience is and try to identify what their specific needs are and what would be the overall experience of the application be to better allow them to fulfill this. Whereas user interfaces are the various techniques that we might use for whether displaying as a table or as a list or as the various aspects of laying it out and making it pretty and being consistent with the color palettes and whatnot in support of creating a well-rounded user experience. So let's talk about some of these. I'd like to distinguish between the two and perhaps look at some of the principles of good user experience designs and good user UI designs, and see some of those principles that have been accumulating throughout the many decades of software engineering, and what the body of research says, and what can we apply going forward and in our own user experience and UI design. So we all deal with user interfaces, right? Whether it's something digital such as this, where it's something at our desktop and do some, or tablets or phones or whatnot. Some of it is indirect manipulation through keyboards and mouse, and or direct manipulation through our tablets and phones as we click and drag and flick things. But usually they are some abstract representation of some data model underneath that we are manipulating. Eventually all this is manipulating some information in the back, some records and relationships between records. So whatever is between us and those actual operations is what we refer to as the user interface. User interface is not only the digital abstractions that we might deal with electronically, but there might be many physical user interfaces that we might take for granted, or we just don't think about them anymore because they're so ingrained in our culture, or how we've seen them there forever, right? Some of them have become iconic and standard across multiple vendors, such as any car that you step in. I think you could pretty much assume that it'll be a steering wheel, a couple pedals, maybe a paddle on the right hand side, and same thing with interacting with stoves of knobs and whatnot. As technology progresses, some of these interfaces evolve over time, and they become less so, right? Less relevant. Eventually, cars will drive themselves, and it'll be a thing of the past that somebody actually drives their car. It'll be as rare, perhaps, as we see today folks riding on a horse. We'll say, "Oh, look, somebody's driving their car." They probably are paying much more insurance because they're much more dangerous on the roads. But as we progress, right, the user interfaces will reflect those changes. Same thing with phones. Usually, these types of interfaces are transient. As we go from one way of interacting to another way of interacting with the same information. Eventually, these will only be on your ear, right, or something that is directly connected to your frontal cortex, right, and there won't be any scrolling or touching or anything, right, and the interface will literally disappear, right, as we're able to interact directly with all this. So all these are all intermediate interactions as the interfaces start to blend and get out of our way. I don't know if anybody's old enough to remember some of these. Very very clunky. I don't know that I ever paid attention to the blinking. I must have. It would have been driving me nuts. The blinking time there. Some of the user interfaces are contradictory, or and folks never really thought it true, and probably because they might have different contexts that might be mutually exclusive, whereas somebody who thinks about this might have a completely different mental model as they interpret the sign. So a lot of whatever we read is and how we interpret is within the context of where we are, and not necessarily two people what might be in the same context, either culturally or technically or mentally. They might interpret what they read depending on their particular context. Also, there might be some cultural differences on how is it that we parse images, right? That depending where we come from, our background culture, we might read content from left to right, from top to bottom. In other cultures, they might read it from right to left, or from the back of a book forwards, right? So the way we might parse an image might be different depending on a particular culture, and so in this one, it might be not immediately relevant or obvious that the 103 and 113 is to the left, whereas runes 114, 128 is to the right, where we don't really know. It's not quite clear how to parse the image. Some images seem to be able to convey lots of information in a small amount of space, very very effectively, and it's very hard to come up with these kinds of these diagrams that are both dense in content, but nevertheless convey the information that is needed. Oftentimes, we have to try and find the right level of abstraction, right, where we are able to remove a lot of the details that are not needed, right, and only focus the mind on only the information that it is needed at the right level of abstraction. For instance, here we've left out the fact that these trains actually don't run in complete straight lines, right? But those details are not necessarily important, to understand, to navigate through this, or that this is at all at scale, right? Or that each one of these stations are actually physically equidistant to each other. Right? Again, those are all irrelevant details that are not needed for the purposes of this, right? That is me trying to navigate through this map, right? So again, it's tough in trying to identify exactly what the right level of abstraction that we need. We oftentimes, depending on who we are, depending on what the purpose, we would want more abstraction or less abstraction, right? If it might be useful to use an actual aerial photograph of the Boston area, and some folks might, for certain purposes, maybe for navigation purposes and whatnot, if I'm sailing or whatnot. But if I'm trying to find my way through the city, perhaps all the trees and all the details might be way too much for me, and I just want only the roads would be plenty for me. So again, level of abstraction is very very hard to determine. That's what's needed. So user experience, as I mentioned earlier, is a strategy that we want to identify what makes the experience of the user successful, right, or pleasant or unpleasant, and depending on what is that they're trying to accomplish within their particular context, within their particular constraints, right? What is it that their intentions are, and what the functionality that we want to allow them, right? And then identify some tactical techniques that we can use to actually provide those affordances to the user. So the idea of the user experience is to first identify who your audience is, which typically is one of the hardest things to do, right? Of who is this for? Who is this going to be? Who is going to be using this, right? If what is their level of technical expertise, right? If this is a system, if this is a system administrator, they might be very well fine with bombardment of lots of information. The more features that you can cram into a small page, the better, right? If this were someone who's less technical savvy, they might be overwhelmed by the sheer amount of information that we're throwing at them, and perhaps they might prefer something that walks them and handholds them through the through the process, where we have a wizard that goes through step 1, 2, and 3 and lay it out for them. And also over time, the application might need to adapt. As folks become aware of the process of how is it that it works, it might become nuisance. Something that before it was welcome that you walk me through the process of the 10 steps that I need to do. After I've done it 20 times, it'll be a nuisance having that you walk me through the same steps. So perhaps I would prefer you to give me some alternative way of now that I know how it works, give me a shortcut. So the body of all these aspects of that we've been learning throughout several decades of building these kind of user interfaces are the interests of research by human-computer interaction engineers, right? That study these kinds of things. What makes a good user interface or a good user experience, right? What are the principles? What are the general principles out of the body of evidence that we have of all these successful and unsuccessful projects that we might have? So, human-computer interaction, study these principles and educate or inform the software engineers as they build applications. I remember, back when, I don't know, several decades ago, in my human-computer interaction class, we were considering the direct manipulation of long lists, right? Of huge, where you might have a scroll bar, and typically and we were comparing the fact of grabbing the thumb, and scrolling it as opposed to using the hand and scrolling. This was much before the iPhone. And back when it was everybody agreed that it would be a bad idea to do direct manipulation on scrolling something so far, so long, right? Obviously, when we saw it on the iPhone, everybody said, "Of course, makes sense," right? But I guess somebody had to show it to us, right, before it became apparent that it was a good solution. So yeah, so things evolve over time, right? As we become more knowledgeable of these techniques. So that's UX, right? We put the user in the middle of the world and try to identify who these folks are, and what are they trying to achieve, and what is the overall experience of the application to let them fulfill what is it that they're trying to achieve. Whereas user interfaces is just a set of techniques that fulfill that user experience, right? That look at what are the layout of the application, whether we're going to use tables or lists, or what specific widgets we might use and lay out to fulfill that user experience, right? That we're going to follow a common standard way of representing things across the entire application. That we have a common way of laying out things so that users are not don't have to relearn a new screen as they go from one screen to the next. They can identify patterns and learn and become familiar with the application. So user interfaces are ways of achieving those user experience. All right. So why do we even care about UX and UI? Well, there are some monetary and issues that we might want to consider. That make a UX important, right? There's some financial aspects on any effort that you pay or invest in improving your user interface. This is an investment in the future of not having to pay it later by folks either returning your product or folks calling you on the phone and asking for support on how is it that you use this thing. So you either invest early on trying to get it right, or later on, once you have the user interface and it's all already deployed and being used by millions of people, right? So the earlier you can address a lot of these issues and have some feedback, some early feedback from real users, the better. This will pay in dividends much later in the future. So there are also some well documented historical comparisons of multiple devices that did fairly the same kind of use cases or the same types of things. For instance, MapQuest. Anybody remember MapQuest? Yeah. Okay. So it kind of more or less provided the same exact functionality or that Google Maps provided, right? But the way it did it was very indirect. Perhaps it was a little bit quirky. That you had to click buttons, the whole page refreshed, way back when anyway. And then came along Google Maps that pretty much gave exactly the same use case, but it introduced a completely different way of interacting with the data, providing some direct manipulation, right, as opposed to indirectly clicking on buttons. You can now grab the data, right, and just flick it, right, and it provided a completely different way of thinking of how you interact with it. Similarly, there's tons of examples, and in particular, there's Diamond Rio, one of the earlier music players that was trying to build its on previous successes on folks that were the Sony Walkman, right? That anybody had a Sony Walkman? No. I had a couple. And so in those types of gadgets, you listened to a tape or a particular set of songs that you were responsible for manipulating, whereas it tried to build on that particular success, and it was successful for a couple of years, and then came along the iPod, which introduced a completely different new way of interacting. And a different way of thinking about the song, right? Of being able to buy a song for $1 as opposed to an entire album. So it completely changed the equation of how we consume the content of music, and it really resonated with users, and the rest is history. Apple was at $1.3 a share in 2001, and then now it's $2,200 in 2015. So just looking at the entire experience, their approach was, well, not only are we selling you the device, we're selling you an entire way of purchasing, of delivering, and then listening for the music. No longer are you going to have different places to go to maintain this. We're going to give you a nice walled garden. As long as you're within this nice walled garden, everything's fine, right? And eventually, the same content you'll be able to consume it in many other devices, right? And we see that many other folks are trying to replicate similar aspects of this walled garden, right? And try to maintain a person happy within this walled garden. So this was one of the mantras of Steve Jobs of. It's not just the technology, the features, or even how fast a particular processor is. They were trying for quite a while to not play that game of being able to compare CPU and RAM, and it's just that's not what we're about, right? So we're selling you an experience, right? So how does this particular thing makes you feel, right? And what is that? Does this fix or solve 80% of what most folks are using, as opposed to providing something much more that a lot of a fewer audience might want. So get something right for a particular audience as opposed to trying to be as broad and not focus on any one in particular. They're very successful at targeting subsets of the audience of designers and educators and folks that work with media, and they really focus on that particular subset and says, well, these are the folks that we're going to go after, and they became very, very successful at it. Yeah, so the design is hard. A lot of it depends on the differences of context, right? That everybody has a different context. Everybody comes from different backgrounds. And so everybody will interpret something based on that particular context, right? That some folks will interpret these as very literal, right? That hit any key. What was that movie that says? It was pretty funny. I laughed out loud. It says, "Drag the mouse across the window, across the screen," and the person was literally dragging the mouse. What was it? Yeah, that one. I was just cracked up, and I could totally see my dad doing something like that. And again, it's within the context and cultural basis of whoever you're asking somebody to do something. It also depends on us, being the geeks we are, and that we are not representative of folks at large, right? That we might be very well suited to consume much more information than most folks, and we might be okay with you filling out a screen with as many buttons and input fields, and we're looking for efficiency. The more you can cram, the better. Whereas some other folks might be totally overwhelmed. And will not appreciate all the additional information that you give them. Did I just see this? This is a pointer? I hadn't seen that. That's pretty cool. So you might be overwhelming your audience, even though you had the best intentions. Just consider my assignments. They're very verbose, and we wanted to provide as much information as possible, as make it a great learning experience, and it's an overwhelming, daunting trying to consume and make sense out of it during a week, plus tons of other things you're tasked to do. So it's very it's a balancing act on how much you can cram into one single thing. It's very hard to do a good design. Certainly we have certain aspects of it that we want to make sure that we identify what the user needs and try to satisfy, give a solution to a user and satisfy a client. And it's better said than done. How do you actually do this? One of the hardest part is that we can't agree on who the user is. Right? That the user is different depending on who you ask. There'll be much different audiences depending on what one particular variable, any particular variable, arbitrary variable. There'll be some folks that are on the right-hand side of that variable, on the left side of that variable. Yeah, just again consider this class, right, where half of you perhaps have been on co-ops, have already done some of this process management. If you've done some Scrum, you've done some of this. Perhaps you've done some coding and on database access, and perhaps half of you haven't, right? And I'm in the middle of this task of trying to walk this fine line between these two types of folks in the course. Everyone will have different types of capabilities, right? We'll have different learning capabilities, different memory, being able to retain information, being able to learn new things. Everybody will have different levels of experience, different cultural backgrounds, right? Different ways to interpret different things. Some people will have different different sensibility, right? Like for instance, in my country, there's people. We're less politically correct. Whereas here perhaps there might be a lot of focus on being politically correct, right? So there's a lot of different sensibility across multiple cultures. So and we have to take those into account to be culturally sensitive. Yeah, there is no one user. That's one of the biggest challenges of designing anything, of building anything. So some folks might have some disability that we might just decide that we're not going to even consider, right? That even though 10% of users might not be able to see the difference between red, green, or yellow, nevertheless, we have a very ubiquitous user interface of using green these traffic lights all over the world, right? Just ignoring some of the audience that relies on these types of interfaces, and these folks might have to find other ways to get a clue and make distinction between the three different colors, right? And be able to, even though make do with the user interface that we have forced on them, right? Yeah, so you can't please everybody, right? There's no multiple size fits all. Everybody has different models of what the products might be. Everybody will have different aims. There's no single user. So how do we do this? How do we target? How do we identify? How do we come up with some hypotheses of what could work, right? And perhaps draw some feedback from some potentially real users out there, right? So considering the various techniques that we've looked at, that we considered earlier, for instance, one of the waterfall, we see that waterfall is not very good at being able to adapt or identify flaws on our user interface and be able to change it accordingly. We would be way too late between coming up with an initial design, and by the time we release this, without having included the end user in any part of the feedback process of any of this, we might have built exactly what we designed, we agreed at the beginning, but having the requirements have changed, the market has moved on, and all sorts of things having changed over time. We might hit it, even though that was what we had agreed to do. It's way too late. So certainly waterfall doesn't work well for UI design. Another one is the iterative approaches that we've been considering, such as agile and all the general iterative approaches, where we do want to include as much we can the end user, right, our client, to give us feedback. Us providing with some initial implementations, a phase one, a minimum viable product, and then getting back some feedback from them. But here too is a little too late, right? That to provide something and use the client as a guinea pig, right? They're probably not gonna they're not going to like it. They're not gonna appreciate that we're using them as guinea pigs and trying out different hypotheses, different ideas on them. We need to be able to do it even earlier. Right, even earlier, before we even get started on delivering an MVP. We need to do it as early as possible, perhaps by using a spiral model where at first we come up with a throwaway set of prototypes, right, that can give us really early indications on where we should go, which way we should direct our efforts. Perhaps on paper, on a whiteboard, and do some really quick use case studies, right? Of some folks actually using the application, using some of these early prototypes, very low, very very inexpensive, very rough prototypes, paper prototypes that we can just throw away. And then once we start, once we have come up with some ideas of what is that we're looking for, we need to identify the users, right? Based on some representative audience that is somewhat similar to our target audience, right? Certainly not the end clients, because they're not going to appreciate being used as guinea pigs. Ideally, we would find a subset of the audience who is representative of real users, right? That perhaps somebody who can be a proxy to a real user, a real client, right? That has more or less the same ethnographics, perhaps the same skill levels, mental and physical abilities, same communication patterns, same culture, same whatever our target audience and demographics is, whether and again. Considering the particular target, their expertise, or whether they're novices, and whether they're using this often or very sporadically, that they want to accomplish the same kinds of things of the end user, and whether we're targeting ease of use, right? Whether we want to use some wizards and walk them and handhold them through the process, or are we targeting some folks who are okay with being more efficient, with giving them some shortcuts and be able to do things much faster, which oftentimes these two are mutually exclusive. Something that's easy usually is not efficient, and vice versa. So one of the best ways to identify and then try out some of the early hypotheses is through through interviews, right? That we meet with the folks. We provide them with some of these prototypes and have them fail, right, at using our early prototypes of these user interfaces, and we jot down what were their challenges, right, and see how we could that informs us on our peculiar user interface. Typically, we come up with a set of hypotheses on what these user interfaces might be. Right, certain questions that we might want to be able to answer. Usually have identified certain use cases that we want to try out. Use cases that might come from our functional requirements that we might have identified already. Being able to find users, or find a service, or assign a service to a provider, or look at all the frequently asked questions for a particular user. So all these would be questions or hypotheses of what user interfaces we might be using, and it might be 2 or 3 screens that would be needed to fulfill that particular functional requirement. Yes, and we would like to put it in front of some real folks, and just have them explain to them what their goal is. Right, there's service providers. They need to answer these questions. They need to be able to. The system administrator needs to be able to look at all the answers. They need to be able to edit those questions, right? Explain to them what the goals are, and then just give them 2 or 3 screens and have them, work at them, see if they can figure it out on their own, right? And try not to lead them or give them clues. That would be cheating. We want them to, if they don't understand it, we want them to fail, right? And identify what is it that why did they fail? Perhaps ask them if it's okay to film them. Right, maybe film their hands as they click and drag, and they type and they manipulate the interface, so that we can gather some empirical evidence, and also speak aloud what is in their head, what is their train of thought as they go through interacting with the interface, so that we can write a lot of these copious and record this as much as we can, so that we can go back and have some data points and make decisions on whether these set of screens were better than these other set of screens. Right? We have multiple folks using different interfaces. These prototypes can be as simple as just pieces of paper, or just maybe cardboard, to give the feeling of using the real product. They could be low fidelity, right? They don't have to be high fidelity. So here's some examples of trying out different screens with on different phones, and this was pre iPhone, right? Where they were trying to cram an entire operating system onto a phone, to a small screen. I guess the same thing that Roxio was trying to do. was trying to cram the idea of older ways of interacting with some information as songs, as in using a Walkman. They were trying to gather or reuse some of those same knowledge, but trying to do it digitally. Same thing here, right? They were trying to cram our understanding of trees and options and menus that work well in large screens, but don't work well in smaller screens, right? So we might draw this and have folks try out as they interact and gather some data points. It might be as well as something that's just drawn on a piece of paper or on a whiteboard. Studies have shown that the fidelity of the user interface doesn't affect as much the results of trying to prove a hypothesis. So if you draw something as ugly as this, or you spend some more time with a nice Photoshop version of this that's a much more higher fidelity, the results typically are not as skewed as you might think, right? That we could just as well use these types of interface. Yes.
If we're conducting a user study, would we be using these kind of prototypes?
Maybe not. Something a little more prettier. Yeah. Yep. But it could be something like this. Could be real quick that you can point out with these cutouts. Would be just as fine. Or you're not necessarily restricted on just using a piece of paper on something that you can hold on your hands. It could be as big as something that you can plaster your walls with multiple screens, and then folks just walk from one screen to the next, right? And folks can point at it together, right? And interact, especially if it's something that is multi-user and there's meant to be multiple users manipulating the same pieces of information. So it could be something much bigger. Also, you have the use of wireframes, where you might have multiple tools, different types of tools that allow you to quickly drag and drop all sorts of widgets on a screen that with lots of dummy data like lorem ipsum and there's Adobe has lots of these really cool tools that with a couple of gestures, right? It draws all these widgets for you on the screen. Having built tons of these screens over the decades, there are already a family or library of well-known types of widgets that are pretty standard. As you build these types of applications. Now, using wireframes, there's some pros and cons. One of the things is that they're very cheap to build. You don't actually have to code anything, although that could be an advantage and disadvantage, right? You don't have to code anything, but at the end of building these things, you end up with no code whatsoever, right? So you have to actually build some of these. Although some tools today, right, allow you to go from a wireframe down to an actually running application, right? That can do the extrapolation from a wireframe down to actual code, and then you can press a button and can generate for you a data model, can generate for you all sorts of HTML and CSS and libraries, and very, very powerful. So there's a lot of advantage of using wireframe, but there's also some disadvantages that they don't capture all the problems. At the end, you don't end up with any source code that you can actually check in or play around with and run.